She smiled when he humiliated her. Then she burned everything he had. Roman Devereaux stood in a ballroom full of Manhattan's most powerful people and let his mistress tell his wife to disappear. And he said nothing. Not a single word. Just stood there, glass in hand, and let the silence do the work. Everyone in that room thought Celeste Devereaux was finished. They thought they were watching a woman break. They were wrong. What they were actually watching was the moment the most dangerous woman in New York decided she was done being invisible. If you want to know what happened next, like this video, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels. The ballroom at the Meridian Hotel on Fifth Avenue was the kind of place that made ordinary people feel small on purpose. 40-foot ceilings. Chandeliers that cost more than most people earned in a decade. Waitstaff who moved through the crowd with the practiced invisibility of people trained to witness without remembering. The annual Hartfield Foundation Gala was, officially, a charity event. Black tie, 7-course dinner, auction items that started at 6 figures. Unofficially, it was the single most important social performance of the Manhattan calendar. The kind of night where reputations were built and quietly dismantled over the course of a few champagne flutes and a handshake. Celeste Devereaux understood this. She had understood it for 12 years. She stood near the second-tier balcony overlooking the main floor, holding a glass of Sancerre she hadn't touched, wearing a midnight blue gown that had been selected by a stylist but altered twice by her own hand because she knew what details people actually remembered. The fabric sat against her collarbone in a particular way. Her hair was pulled back, clean and severe, which was a choice that communicated something different than the loose, soft styles the other wives favored. She had made that choice deliberately. Everything Celeste did was deliberate. From where she stood, she could see her husband working the room below. Roman Devereaux was magnetic in the way that men who've never been told no tend to become. An effortless gravitational pull that had less to do with charm and more to do with the knowledge that surrounded him like weather. People didn't crowd around Roman because they liked him. They crowded around him because proximity to him still meant something in this city. Because his name opened certain doors and closed certain others. Because the men who controlled this room's true architecture, the finance, the contracts, the political machinery, the enforcement apparatus that kept all of it humming, those men still deferred to Roman Devereaux, at least publicly, at least tonight. He was wearing the dark charcoal brioni she had ordered for him 6 months ago. She had selected it because it photographed well and communicated a specific kind of restrained authority that his usual choices, flashier, more aggressive, undermined. He looked good. He always looked good. That was never the problem with Roman. The problem with Roman was that he confused looking good with being good, confused attention for power, confused fear for loyalty. She had spent 12 years building the machinery that made him untouchable. She had spent 12 years understanding the difference. She watched him laugh at something Senator Caldwell said, the easy, practiced laugh of a man who had never in his adult life been uncertain about how a room would receive him. Beside him, at a distance just slightly too close to be appropriate but calibrated precisely for deniability, stood Vanessa Hartwell. Celeste had known about Vanessa for 11 months, not suspected. Known. She had a name, a phone number, an address in Tribeca, a comprehensive financial picture including the lease payments Roman was making on the apartment and the platinum card he'd issued her and the jewelry purchases that had started small and accelerated in the way these things always did when a man began confusing infatuation for something more durable. She had chosen to say nothing, not because she was afraid, not because she was without options, because Celeste Devereaux had spent so many years operating in the space between what people saw and what was actually true that silence had become her most precise instrument. You didn't reveal what you knew until the knowing of it served you. You didn't move until the movement would cost you nothing. She had been waiting for the right moment. She had not expected it to arrive quite like this. Vanessa Hartwell was 29 years old, the daughter of a mid-level venture capitalist from Connecticut who had leveraged a second-generation surname into an appearance of old money. She was objectively beautiful in the way of women who had been told they were beautiful from a young enough age that it had become structural, a foundation they built everything else on. She wore a red gown that made a specific kind of statement at a black tie event. She had positioned herself beside Roman with the practiced casualness of a woman who had been rehearsing this moment. Celeste recognized the performance because she had studied performances like it her entire life. What Celeste had not anticipated, what she would acknowledge privately in the months that followed, represented the single genuine miscalculation of a 12-year strategy, was that Vanessa was not patient. She did not watch the signal from Roman that would have told Celeste this was planned and coordinated. She watched Vanessa make the decision herself, in real time, the way a person who has been waiting for permission finally decides permission isn't necessary. She watched Vanessa's eyes find her across the room. That brief calculating scan, the slight adjustment of posture, the decision forming. She watched Vanessa begin moving toward her. Celeste stayed where she was. She set her Sancerre down on the rail with a steadiness that a woman with shaking hands could not have managed. The crowd in the immediate vicinity didn't part exactly, but a kind of attention gathered around Vanessa as she moved, because beautiful women in red at important events generate that kind of gravitational pull. And by the time Vanessa reached the balcony level and crossed the 30 feet of marble floor between them, the space around them had clarified. The conversations nearby had dropped in volume. Heads had turned with the subtle, practiced indirection of Manhattan socialites who had learned to appear not to watch while watching absolutely everything. Vanessa stopped 3 feet away. She was taller than Celeste by an inch, which she used. "You've had a good run," Vanessa said. Her voice was confident but pitched precisely to carry. Not shouted, not whispered. Calibrated for the ambient noise level of the room so that the people around them could hear without straining. Celeste looked at her. She did not respond immediately. She let the silence breathe. "Roman needs more than what you're giving him," Vanessa continued. "He needs someone who can actually be present, who can be real with him, not—" She gestured vaguely at Celeste, at the gown, at the composed, measured stillness of her. "Whatever this is." "Whatever this is," Celeste repeated. "You're a prop, Celeste. You've always been a prop, even if you don't know it." The room was quiet in the way that rooms get when something genuinely important is happening, and everyone understands it simultaneously. Not the artificial quiet of a speech, the held breath quiet of a real moment, the kind that gets recalled at dinner parties for years. Below, on the main floor, Roman had not moved. Celeste looked toward him. He was watching. Glass still in hand, that same easy, practiced stillness he deployed when he wanted to communicate that whatever was happening around him was beneath his attention. He didn't move to intervene. He didn't signal anything. He simply stood and watched in the way of a man who had decided his silence was not complicity, but preference. Celeste looked back at Vanessa. She smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not a broken smile. It was the specific smile of a person who has just watched something arrive exactly as they had calculated it would, if they had been patient enough to wait. It was the smile of a woman who had spent 12 years making decisions in the space between what people thought they knew and what was actually true, and who had just watched her final outstanding question answer itself. "Of course," she said. "I'll step aside." Vanessa blinked. She had prepared for several versions of this conversation. She had not prepared for that. "Good," she managed. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," Celeste said and turned away without hurry. She collected her Sancerre. She descended the balcony stairs. She moved through the crowd with the same unhurried composure that she had maintained for 12 years at events exactly like this one, stopping twice to exchange brief pleasantries with people whose names were in her phone under categories she never discussed with Roman, and by the time she reached the hotel lobby, she had already begun working through the sequence. She did not cry in the car. She had not cried in 11 months, since the night she had first confirmed what she already knew about Vanessa Hartwell, and she had given herself 40 minutes then, and she was not going to give herself more time than that again. The work did not accommodate grief. The work accommodated precision. She told her driver to take her home. She looked out the window at the city she had spent 12 years learning to navigate, not as Roman's wife, but as something the city didn't have a clean name for. And she began, methodically, to calculate. The house in Westchester was quiet when she arrived. Roman would not be home until late. Possibly not tonight. She understood this the same way she understood most things about their arrangement, completely, without illusion, with the specific clarity of someone who had stopped lying to herself so long ago that she could barely remember what the lie had felt like. She changed out of the midnight blue gown in the master closet. She hung it herself. She put on clothes she could work in. dark trousers, a simple blouse, and she went to the study that the house staff understood was not to be entered when the door was closed. The room was arranged around a desk that Roman had never used because he didn't understand what the desk was for. He thought it was for appearance, like most things in his life. The bookshelves behind it held actual books, read, annotated in places where the margin notation was narrow and precise. The filing drawers were coded with the system she had developed herself. The computer on the desk was not connected to any network Roman was aware of. She sat down. She opened a locked drawer in the lower left of the desk and removed a legal pad and a pen that wrote cleanly. She began to write names, not dramatically, not in the way of a woman in a film, all wild motion and rage. She wrote them the way she wrote anything, methodically, in columns, with notation beside each name indicating category, relationship, leverage, exposure. She had spent 12 years keeping this list in her head because writing it down had always carried risk. Tonight the calculus had changed. The risk of inaction now exceeded the risk of documentation. She wrote for 40 minutes. When she was done, she looked at the list for a long time. Then she picked up her phone. Not the one that appeared in Roman's household accounts. The second phone, an Android she'd kept in a waterproof case at the back of the drawer, charged every 2 weeks on a rotation. She turned it on and waited for it to cycle through its startup sequence. There were 3 numbers in the contacts. The first was labeled M. She dialed it. It rang 4 times before a man picked up. His voice was careful, the voice of someone who had learned to answer unknown calls without displaying recognition. "Yes, it's me," she said. A pause. "Thought you'd retired." "I did," she said. "Now I'm not." Another pause, longer. She could hear him processing this, recalibrating. "Timeline?" "Tonight," she said. "Beginning tonight." "How complete?" She looked at the list on the legal pad. "Complete." The line was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, there was something in his voice that was not quite respect and not quite fear, but occupied the same territory as both. "The accounts?" "Start with the Cayman structure," she said. "Then the Luxembourg holding, the Vienna arrangement last. It'll take longer to dissolve cleanly. And if he figures it out before he won't," she said. "He's never understood where the money actually lives." She hung up. She sat in the quiet of the study for a moment. Outside, through the window, the lights of Westchester spread out in the darkness. And beyond them, 30 miles south, Manhattan's skyline made its permanent argument with the night sky. She had looked at that skyline from this window 100 times and thought various things about it. Tonight she thought about the first time she had arrived in this city, 23 years old, educated beyond her circumstances, carrying a specific and unusual set of capabilities that she had not yet understood how to convert into survival. She had understood it eventually. Roman Devereaux had found her at 24, at a different kind of event, a mid-level finance networking dinner on the Lower East Side, nothing like the Meridian Hotel, nothing like the life that followed. He had been 32, already on his way up through the criminal infrastructure he'd inherited, and was in the process of dramatically expanding. He had looked at her the way men look at beautiful women, and thought he understood what he was seeing. He had seen the surface. He had not seen the intelligence that sat behind it, that had been sitting behind a surface like that for her entire life, learning to be invisible because visible intelligence in women was something the world around her had consistently punished. She had understood in the first 3 months of their relationship that Roman Devereaux was building something that would either consume him or make him untouchable, and that the difference between those 2 outcomes was not violence or muscle or the will to use both, which Roman possessed in ample measure. The difference was architecture, systems, the ability to translate raw criminal power into something that could interface with legitimate finance, legitimate politics, legitimate law, in ways that made the underlying machine invisible. Roman didn't have that. She did. She had made a decision at 24 that she had examined from every angle in the years since, and that she did not regret even now, even tonight, sitting in the study of a house that was technically his name on the deed. She had made a decision to build something. Not for him. Alongside him, yes. Using his resources and his muscle and his existing infrastructure as the foundation, yes. But the thing she built was hers. The intelligence was hers. The relationships she cultivated, the offshore structures, the political channels, The legal architecture that made Roman Devereaux genuinely untouchable for over a decade. Those were hers. He had confused benefiting from a thing for owning it. That confusion was about to become expensive. She didn't sleep. She worked through the night in the study, methodically moving through the sequence she had designed over the previous 11 months, a sequence she had told herself she would never need to use, that she had designed purely as contingency planning, the way she designed everything as contingency planning, because she had learned early that the space between a plan and its execution was where unprepared people died. By 3 in the morning, she had initiated contact with 7 separate holding structures. By 4:30, the Luxembourg arrangement had been transferred. The Vienna accounts were in motion. 3 corporate entities that existed on paper as Roman subsidiaries, but were structured in ways that made Celeste the actual controlling party. Structures Roman had signed documents for without reading them, because he trusted her to handle the legal architecture, because he had always trusted her to handle the legal architecture. Those entities were being quietly repositioned. By 6 in the morning, she had made 2 more calls. The first was to a man named Aldrich, whom the financial world knew as the senior managing director of a legitimate private equity firm, and whom a much smaller number of people knew in his other capacity, which involved the movement of money through structures that didn't appear on balance sheets. Aldrich had been Celeste's resource for 8 years. Roman had met him twice at events and believed him to be a minor business contact. "The restructuring is beginning," she told him. "Roman authorized?" "I'm authorizing," she said. A pause. "Understood." The second call was to a woman named Petra, who was a partner at a Manhattan law firm that handled legitimate corporate work and who also maintained a separate practice area that did not appear in the firm's marketing materials. Celeste had cultivated Petra over 6 years, beginning with a referral that had looked like a favor and had functioned as the first brick in a structure Petra had never quite seen the full shape of until Celeste needed her to. "I need dissolution documentation for the following entities," Celeste said, and read from the list. Petra was quiet for a moment, then, "Some of these are structured as Romans." "Review the control provisions," Celeste said. "Carefully." Another pause. Longer. "I see." "Monday morning," Celeste said. "Everything properly executed." "I know the timeline," Celeste said. "That's the timeline." She hung up and sat back in the chair, and for the first time in several hours, she allowed herself to simply exist in the moment rather than move through it. The windows of the study were beginning to lighten at the edges. Not sunrise yet, but the suggestion of it, that early morning atmospheric shift when the darkness loses confidence. She thought about Roman, not with anger. Not anymore. She had spent her anger in the first few months after confirming what she knew, had given herself space to feel what it actually felt like to have spent 12 years building something extraordinary with a person who fundamentally did not see you, and she had come out the other side of that with a clarity that was cleaner and colder than grief. Roman was what he was. She had known what he was at 24. She had made her calculation with open eyes, what she had not calculated for. And this was the thing she sat with, in the growing light of the study, with her list on the desk and the phone calls made and the machinery beginning to turn. What she had not calculated for was that it would take this form. That after 12 years, the humiliation would not be private and quiet, and the kind of thing a person could absorb without witnesses. That he would let it happen in front of 300 people in the ballroom of the Meridian Hotel and do nothing. That was the part she hadn't planned for. Not the betrayal, the public nothingness of it, the deliberate witnessed erasure of her. She closed the legal pad. She put the phone back in the drawer. She locked it. Then she stood up, went to the window, and looked at the skyline for a long time. Roman came home at 8 in the morning. She was in the kitchen when she heard the front door, making coffee with the unhurried precision she brought to everything. She heard his footsteps in the entrance hall, that particular gait, confident to the point of casual, the walk of a man who had not, in recent memory, entered a space expecting anything but deference. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at her for a moment. She could see him calibrating, reading her posture, her expression, the absence of visible emotion, running it against whatever he'd expected to find when he came home after a night like last night. "You left early," he said. "I was tired." He moved into the kitchen, got himself a glass of water. She watched him drink it with his back to her, looking out the kitchen window at the backyard. Vanessa, he started. Don't, she said. Not with heat, just as a fact. He turned to look at her. Something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly, because Roman wasn't built for guilt, but something in the same neighborhood. A recognition that the conversation wasn't going to go the way he'd arranged it in his head on the drive home. She got ahead of herself, he said. Last night. That wasn't... I didn't tell her to do that. I know, Celeste said. He looked at her. So then, I said I know, she said. I didn't say it changed anything. A beat of silence. She poured her coffee. What does that mean? He said. She looked at him. This man she had met at 24, who had large hands and a specific quality of stillness that she had confused, briefly, with depth, and who had turned out to have extraordinary capacity for violence, and a surprisingly functional intelligence when it came to reading the people around him, and essentially no capacity whatsoever for the kind of structural, systemic thinking that separated an operation that lasted from one that eventually collapsed. This man who had stood in a ballroom last night and let 300 people watch his wife get told to disappear and said nothing. It means I think you should stay with Vanessa tonight, she said, and for the foreseeable future. He stared at her. You're serious? I'm always serious, she said. That's something you've had 12 years to learn. His jaw tightened slightly. You're not going to make this dramatic. No, she agreed. I'm not. He looked at her for a long time. She could see him trying to find the angle, the emotion, the leverage, the thing he could use to get the conversation back to territory he understood. Roman was accustomed to operating in a world where everyone wanted something from him, where every interaction had a price, where his power made him the center of gravity in any room. He was not accustomed to interacting with someone who was simply, calmly indicating that she was done. The business, he started, is being handled, she said, as it always has been. She picked up her coffee. She walked out of the kitchen. He left before noon. She watched his car leave from the study window, and then she went back to work. The calls she'd made overnight had set the initial structures in motion, but this was the detailed work, the documentation, the verification, the careful examination of each moving piece to make sure the sequence would run clean. She worked through the day without eating, which was a habit she'd developed during the early years and had never managed to shed, and by late afternoon she had confirmed that the Cayman structure was dissolved and the funds redirected. At 4, she received a text from Aldrich. Vienna confirmed. Clean. At 5:30, Petra sent a single word. Monday. At 6, her regular phone rang. Roman. She let it go to voicemail. He called again at 6:15 and 6:40. She let them all go. She understood something about the timing. The calls were too frequent and too early for him to have discovered anything specific. At this stage, nothing would be visible to him yet. The calls were anxiety. The particular unfamiliar anxiety of a man who had spent his life as the center of everything suddenly getting the first faint signal, like a shift in barometric pressure before a storm, that something in the atmosphere had changed. He couldn't name it yet. He would be able to name it by Monday. She sat at the desk and thought about Monday. She thought about the sequence of events that would begin to unfold when Roman's financial people started running their routine morning checks and discovered that several of the accounts they were accustomed to accessing had changed status overnight. She thought about the conversations that would happen, the calls that would be made, the specific moment when Roman would understand that the disruption was not technical, not a system error, not a banking irregularity. She thought about the expression on his face. She was surprised to find that she felt very little about it. Not satisfaction, not anger. Something quieter, more fundamental. The specific feeling of a person who has spent a long time operating under a constraint that has finally been removed. Not freedom exactly, because freedom was a word that implied the constraint had ever been total, and it hadn't. She had always moved within the architecture she'd built, had always maintained the invisible, separate infrastructure that was hers and only hers, the company that did not appear in Roman's organizational structure, the relationships that ran through channels he had never been part of. What she felt was clarity. The feeling of no longer being required to perform a role that had long since ceased to serve any purpose except inertia. Sunday she spent at the apartment, not the Westchester house, the other apartment, a 2-bedroom in a building in Midtown that existed under a name that was not Celeste Devereaux, that she had maintained for 9 years. that Roman had never known existed. She had told herself when she first took the lease that it was practical. Emergency planning, the kind of contingency preparation that her particular situation demanded. She knew in the moments when she was honest with herself that it had always been more than that. It had been the space where she existed as something other than Roman Devereaux's wife, where the files that constituted the true architecture of everything she'd built were stored in a secured system, where the company that had been growing quietly in the years since she'd incorporated it, not as a financial vehicle for Roman's empire, but as her own independent structure, seated with her own capital and grown through her own relationships, where that company's operations were actually run. Axiom Strategic Consulting. The name appeared nowhere in Roman's world. It appeared in the legitimate financial press 3 times in the last 18 months, in contexts that were accurate but carefully understated. A brief mention in a deal announcement, a single line in a private equity trade publication, a reference in an industry newsletter. She had let it grow slowly, below the visibility threshold that would have required her to answer for it in any domestic context. It was now, by her last calculation, worth more than the entirety of Roman's legitimate asset portfolio. She sat in the apartment on Sunday evening with her files open and her second laptop running and the Sunday silence of Midtown around her, and thought about what came next. What came next was not revenge. She was precise about this with herself. Revenge was reactive, emotional, oriented toward the pain of the other person rather than the construction of something lasting. She was not interested in Roman's pain. She was interested in her own forward motion. What she was dismantling was not built to harm him, exactly. It was built to reclaim, to take back the structural elements of an empire that existed because of her intelligence and her work and her 12 years of invisible labor, and to remove them from a context that no longer served her. The fact that Roman would experience this as devastating was a consequence, not a goal. She closed the laptop. She looked out the window at Midtown Sunday evening, quieter than the weekday version, the streets below moving at a different rhythm, the city in one of its rare moments of something that wasn't quite rest, but was at least different. She thought about the woman who had stood on that balcony at the Meridian Hotel 24 hours ago and smiled. She thought about what that smile had cost her. Nothing, it turned out. It had cost her absolutely nothing. Monday morning arrived with the specific gray light of a New York November, cold, colorless, the city looking like it had decided not to make the effort. Celeste was already at the Axiom offices before 8. The company occupied the 14th and 15th floors of a building on Park Avenue South, which was not the address of an empire, but was the address of something that had decided not to announce itself prematurely. The offices were good, but not ostentatious. The staff she had assembled, 12 people, each selected with the same methodical precision she brought to everything, were already at their desks. She had told her assistant, a composed woman named Dara, who had worked for her for 3 years and knew better than to ask questions that weren't her business, that she was not available for unscheduled calls today. At 8:47, her regular phone began ringing. She let it ring. At 9:15, it rang again. Different number sets. She recognized it as belonging to Marcus Webb, Roman's senior financial operations manager. The man who ran the day-to-day account monitoring that would have caught the first anomalies. She let it ring. At 9:52, her phone rang a third time. Roman's direct line. She picked it up. "The Cayman accounts," he said. No preamble. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in a long time. Not anger, which she had heard frequently, but something underneath anger, something that lived in the space where certainty used to be. "Yes," she said. "They're gone." "Yes." A pause, long enough that she could hear him breathing. "Celeste, Marcus should also check the Luxembourg structure," she said. "And the Vienna holding. The processing will complete by end of business today." Silence. "The Donovan Street properties," she continued, "are registered under Alderton Holdings, LLC. Review the original incorporation documents. Pay attention to the control provisions. Specifically, page 11 of the Alderton Primary Agreement, the section Roman signed in 2019 regarding beneficial ownership." More silence. She could hear, in the quality of it, the specific sound of a man experiencing a world rearranging itself. "What did you do?" he said, not a question. The inflection was wrong for a question. It was the sound of a sentence that didn't know how to end. I did what I always do, she said. I managed the architecture. I will. He stopped, started again. You can't just review page 11, she said, and the equivalent provisions in the Luxembourg documentation. Petra von at Schaefer and Morris prepared those documents. She'll confirm if you ask her. She hung up. She set the phone face down on her desk. Dara appeared in the doorway. You have the Mercer Group call in 10 minutes. I know, Celeste said. Give me 8. She turned to her window. 14 floors above Park Avenue South, the November morning was doing what it did. Gray, functional, indifferent to the particular catastrophe currently unfolding in various phone calls and panicked account reviews across Roman Devereaux's financial infrastructure. She thought about a moment 11 years ago, early in their marriage, before she had fully understood what she was building or how large it would eventually become. Roman had introduced her to a man named Carver at a dinner, a man whose position in the organization's legal protection apparatus was significant. Carver had shaken her hand and spent the next 40 minutes speaking exclusively to Roman while she sat at the table and listened. He had addressed her twice, once to ask if she wanted more wine, and once to indicate that he'd heard she had a background in finance, which was charming. She had spent the next 3 years making herself essential to Carver in ways he never quite understood, until his continued position in the organization depended on the maintenance of structures she controlled. She thought about that. She thought about the look on Roman's face that first morning in the kitchen, the calibrating look, trying to find the angle. She thought about Vanessa Hartwell in a red dress saying, "You're a prop, Celeste." She thought about the particular clarity of a woman who has spent 12 years being invisible in a room, deciding, finally, to turn on the lights. "Dara," she said without turning from the window. "Yes?" "Get me the Mercer file and tell them I'll be ready in 5. She was in a meeting at 2 in the afternoon when her phone vibrated with a message from a number she recognized as belonging to Marco Reyes, a name Roman knew as a peripheral business contact, a man who moved in certain circles that overlapped with Roman's, and who was, in the actual architecture of things, the primary liaison to 3 of the most significant organized crime families on the East Coast. The message said, "We need to meet. Not about Roman, about you." She read it once. She turned it face down and finished her meeting. But something shifted in the back of her mind, in the deep, quiet space where she kept the calculation she wasn't ready to surface yet. Not about Roman, about you. She had built an empire from the invisible center of someone else's kingdom, and apparently word was getting out. By Wednesday, she knew, Roman's world would begin to truly fracture. The political channels would start to close. The federal case that had been dormant for 3 years due to her careful cultivation of certain relationships would begin to breathe again. The rival families that had kept their distance because she had architected a balance of power that made aggression costly, would start to sense the vacuum. She had not caused any of that directly. She had simply removed the invisible structures that had been holding it all in place. The empire had always been held together by her intelligence. Without her intelligence, it would discover quickly what it had actually been built on. She picked the phone back up. She texted Marco Reyes. "Thursday, my office, 3 p.m. She put the phone down. She pulled up the Mercer documents and began reading, with the same focused, precise attention she brought to everything. The new proposal that would, if she handled the next 6 weeks correctly, establish Axiom Strategic Consulting as the dominant financial advisory operation in a market she had been quietly positioning herself for over 3 years. Outside, the November afternoon was darkening over Park Avenue South. Somewhere across the city, in an office she was no longer going to see again, Roman Devereaux was making phone calls to people who were starting to understand that the answers they needed were not in any of the places they'd been told to look. And the woman who had built the kingdom was sitting at a desk on the 14th floor, working. As she had always worked, in the way she had always worked, till invisible to everyone who didn't know where to look, until Thursday, when Marco Reyes was going to walk into her office with an offer that was going to force her to decide, for the first time, whether she wanted to run an empire from the shadows or from the center. She hadn't made that decision yet, but she was already thinking about. Marco Reyes arrived 4 minutes early. Celeste noticed this because she noticed everything, and because 4 minutes early was a specific kind of statement, Not the aggressive punctuality of someone trying to establish dominance, not the fashionable lateness of someone performing indifference, but the 4-minute margin of a man who was genuinely uncertain how this meeting was going to go and had decided that arriving slightly ahead of schedule was the safest expression of that uncertainty. She was already at her desk when Dara showed him in. He was 51, compact, with the kind of face that had been handsome in a previous decade and had since settled into something more useful, watchful, unreadable, the face of a man who had survived long enough in difficult rooms to understand that expression was currency. He wore a charcoal suit that was good but not showy. He carried nothing, no briefcase, no phone visible, no prop of any kind. He walked into the Axiom offices and looked around with the specific, calibrated attention of someone performing an assessment while appearing merely to admire the view. Celeste stood. They shook hands. His grip was firm and brief, professional. The handshake of someone who understood it communicated exactly as much as intended, and nothing more. "Mrs. Devereaux?" he said. "Miss Voss," she said. He paused for a fraction of a second. "Excuse me? In this office, I'm Celeste Voss. That's the name on the incorporation documents, the lease, and every client contract we've executed. I'd appreciate it if you'd use it." He looked at her for a moment, then he sat down in the chair across from her desk and said, "Celeste Voss." "Thank you." She sat. She did not offer coffee. She did not do the social scaffolding that most meetings began with, the performative warmth that was really just delay. She had 3 more meetings after this one and a call with a Tokyo firm at 7 that she'd been building toward for 6 weeks. "Your message said not about Roman," she said. "It's not." "Then what?" Marco folded his hands in his lap. He had the stillness of a man who'd learned that the most effective thing in a conversation was usually to say the next sentence and then stop. The Battaglia family, the Osei organization, and Carver Chen on the West Coast. All 3 reached out to me in the last 72 hours. She waited. "Not to Roman," he said, "to me, asking about you." The room was quiet. Outside, 14 floors down, Park Avenue South moved through its Thursday afternoon without caring about any of this. "What specifically," she said, "whether you were operating independently, whether the financial infrastructure they'd been interfacing with for years was Roman's or yours." He paused. "Whether you were available." "Available," she repeated, "for consultation, advisory, structural work." He held her gaze. "The Battaglia family's legitimate portfolio has been bleeding for 2 years because their financial architecture is 30 years old, and their current people don't know how to modernize it without exposing the underlying structure. The Osei organization has 3 pending federal investigations and no functioning legal shield. Carver Chen is trying to expand into Asian markets and has no idea how to move money across those jurisdictions without triggering FinCEN alerts." Marco paused. All 3 of them, independently, came to the same conclusion in the same 72-hour window. Which conclusion? That the reason Roman Devereaux was untouchable for a decade had nothing to do with Roman Devereaux. Celeste looked at him. Marco continued, and that whoever actually built that architecture is probably in the process of deciding what to do next. She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that she used as an instrument. She had learned that men in these conversations tended to fill silence, and that what they filled it with was usually more honest than what they'd prepared to say. Marco, to his credit, waited her out. "I'm a legitimate consulting firm," she said finally. "I know what you are," he said, "and I know what you know, and the people I'm describing know that too." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm not here to make you an offer, Ms. Voss. I'm here because they asked me to make contact and because I've been watching what you built for 8 years, and I think you deserve to know that the room you've actually been operating in is a lot larger than the one Roman thought he was running." She picked up her pen, set it down. "Thursday next week," she said, "I'll need written documentation of the specific structural problems each organization is facing. No names on the documents, coded references only. My assistant will send you a format template by end of day." Marco looked at her for a moment. "That's a yes." "That's a preliminary assessment," she said. "I don't say yes to things I haven't fully examined." He stood. They shook hands again. He moved toward the door and then stopped, one hand on the frame. "Roman called Battaglia yesterday," he said, "looking for money, looking for support. He turned to look at her. Battaglia didn't call him back. He left. Celeste sat very still for exactly 30 seconds. Then she picked up the phone and called Dara. Roman found out about Axiom on Friday. She knew it was Friday because that was when he stopped calling her regular phone and started calling the Axiom main line, which meant someone had done the digging that surfaced the incorporation documents, which meant he had people working on it, which meant the panic had reached a level where he was deploying resources rather than simply making phone calls in the hope that this was a manageable situation. It was not a manageable situation. She was in a client meeting when Dara knocked and entered, something Dara did not do during meetings, which meant the knock itself was information. She excused herself and stepped into the corridor. Roman Devereaux has called 4 times in the last hour, Dara said. He's on the line currently. He says it's urgent. Tell him I'm unavailable. He says, Dara. Yes. Tell him I'm unavailable. She went back into the meeting. He appeared in person at 6:15. She was the last one in the office. She was often the last one in the office. And she heard the elevator open and knew from the particular weight of the footsteps in the corridor that it was Roman before she saw him. She had spent 12 years learning the specific sound of his movement through space. She had not yet unlearned it. He came through the door of her office and stopped. She watched him take in the room, the desk, the files, the view of Park Avenue South behind her, the Axiom name on the glass partition outside. She watched him do the calculation she'd watched him do 100 times, the rapid, intuitive assessment of a situation, the reading of physical space for information, the thing he was genuinely good at. How long, he said. The firm has been operating for 4 years. The preliminary structure was established 9 years ago. He stared at her. 9 years. The initial seed capital came from a performance bonus structure in the Alderton Agreement, the one you signed. Page 17. Something moved across his face, not anger yet, still in the territory just before anger, where the brain was processing information it didn't want. You've been running a company, he said. Yes. While I was also managing the architecture of your operation. Yes. People with my particular capabilities tend to be able to sustain more than one project simultaneously. She paused. It's part of what makes them useful. He walked forward 2 steps, stopped at the desk, put both hands flat on the surface, and leaned toward her. She did not move. The accounts, Celeste. I've already explained the legal basis. I don't care about the legal basis, he said. His voice had dropped. This was the voice she had heard him use in other rooms, with other people, and she had always understood it as a specific kind of signal. Not the beginning of violence, but the thing that lived in the space just before the beginning of violence. The warning pressure that most people responded to by adjusting their behavior. I care about the fact that my accounts are gone. My political contacts aren't answering. Webb tells me 3 of our corporate structures dissolved this week. Dissolve. Like they were nothing. Like I was nothing. Like they were what they legally were, she said, which is entities controlled by their actual beneficial owner. You are my wife. I was your wife, she said. Who built your empire? That distinction matters. He straightened, looked at her for a long moment. Vanessa was, he started. I don't want to talk about Vanessa. She got ahead of herself. I told you that one night doesn't mean Roman. She said his name with a flatness that stopped him. You stood in that ballroom and said nothing. 300 people watched. You said nothing. She looked at him steadily. That's not about Vanessa. That was about you deciding that your comfort in that moment was worth more than 12 years. I want you to understand that I understand that. I'm not angry. I'm just done. He looked at her. She could see him processing this, trying to find the lever, the thing to pull that would move this back to terrain he could manage. Roman in a business confrontation was formidable. Roman in an emotional one was a man working with half his instruments missing. I need the accounts back, he said. No. The federal... He stopped. Celeste, if the Harmon investigation moves forward without... It will move forward, she said. I withdrew 3 contacts at the DOJ last week. The Harmon case file has been sitting in a sealed status because of a procedural arrangement that required annual renewal. That renewal didn't happen. He went still. You did that on purpose, he said. I declined to maintain an arrangement that existed to protect an operation I'm no longer part of. That's going to... He stopped again. She watched him calculate the exposure, watched his face do the specific thing it did when a situation exceeded the containment strategies available to him. Roman, she said, you need to go. I'm not going anywhere until... You need to go, she said again. And you need to get a criminal defense attorney, not the firm you've been using. They're a conflict. Someone independent. Someone good. She paused. I can give you a name if you want one. He stared at her. You do that, he said. The disbelief in his voice was unguarded in a way that told her how genuinely he was rattled. Roman didn't lose control of his presentation. She had almost never seen him lose control of his presentation. I don't want you in prison, she said. I want you out of my life. Those are different goals, and they don't require the same actions. He looked at her for a long time. Then he turned and walked out of her office without saying anything else. She listened to his footsteps in the corridor, heard the elevator, heard the building go quiet. She sat back in her chair and let out a slow breath. The weekend was Vanessa's education. Celeste was not present for it. She knew what was happening through sources she didn't discuss and through the particular information-carrying quality of silence. The way certain people stopped calling Roman, the way certain invitations that had arrived at the Westchester house for years suddenly didn't, the way the ecosystem of a powerful man's social world begins to recalibrate when the mechanisms of his power show signs of failure. She heard, through a channel she'd cultivated carefully over 7 years inside the social infrastructure of this specific world, that Vanessa had arrived at the Westchester house on Friday night expecting the dynamic that she'd understood to exist. Roman's world, Roman's power, Roman's staff, Roman's access, and had found something considerably more complicated. The staff, she understood, was technically employed through a household management company whose contract renewed on Celeste's authorization. They were professional. They were not warm. The business calls Roman needed to make over the weekend, calls to associates, to people whose responses would tell him how far the collapse had progressed. Those calls were happening while Vanessa was in the house. She was present for the information in a way she'd never been before. She was hearing for the first time the actual material reality of the world she'd been orbiting. And the world was not what she'd thought it was. Celeste understood, without witnessing it, that this was a specific kind of education. The education of standing in a house that feels like power and discovering that the power wasn't structural, it was personal, and the person it belonged to had left. She didn't think about Vanessa with cruelty. She thought about her with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite indifference. A woman who had looked at a surface and made decisions based on what the surface communicated without asking what was underneath it. Celeste had spent her entire life asking what was underneath things. She had no patience for the failure to ask, but she also understood that the world had not consistently rewarded the asking, and that some people had learned to stop. The world Vanessa was discovering this weekend would teach her, one way or another, to start asking. Monday of the second week broke open. Webb called her at 9 in the morning. Not Roman's financial operations manager calling on Roman's behalf. Webb calling from a cell number she didn't recognize, voice stripped of its usual professional composure. Something underneath it that sounded like a man standing in a building that was making structural sounds. The Harmon investigation, he said. It's been upgraded. I don't know who your contacts were, but whatever they were holding in place, it's been handled appropriately, she said. Celeste. The use of her name, unprofessional, unguarded. There are going to be subpoenas, the grand jury. Mr. Webb, she said. Are you calling me in your capacity as Roman's financial operations manager? A pause. I'm calling you because I've worked in this organization for 9 years, and I want to understand what's happening. Then I'd suggest you find your own attorney, she said, and I'd suggest you do it today. Have a good morning. She hung up. The subpoenas arrived, she learned later, by early afternoon. Not to her. She had structured her involvement in Roman's operation with enough legal distance that her exposure was minimal and manageable. But to the corporate entities, to the remaining account structures, to 3 individuals in Roman's organization whose names appeared on documentation that was now accessible to federal investigators. By Tuesday, two of Roman's senior lieutenants had retained their own defense counsel. When men in an organization start getting their own lawyers, the organization has already begun to come apart. She understood this dynamic because she had studied it in 3 other organizations over the years, from the outside, as a structural analysis exercise. The moment individual self-interest separates from collective loyalty is the moment the collective stops functioning. It doesn't happen in a single event. It happens in a series of individual decisions, each one rational from the perspective of the person making it, each one adding weight to the collapse. Roman's people were making those decisions. She was in the Tokyo call Wednesday evening when her phone lit up with a number she recognized as belonging to a man named Deshaun Lattimore, one of Roman's senior operational people, not financial, not legal, operational, which meant physical, which meant the part of the organization that moved things and people and enforced arrangements. Lattimore calling her was outside any pattern she had a framework for. She finished the Tokyo call. She stared at the missed notification for a long moment. Then she called him back. "There's a problem," Lattimore said when he picked up. His voice had a specific quality. Not panic. Lattimore wasn't a man who panicked, but a controlled urgency that she recognized as genuine. Someone needs to know about it who still has the ability to think straight. "What kind of problem?" "Salazar," he said. She went still. The Salazar family was the primary rival organization to Romans in the Northeast Corridor. They had maintained a cold détente for 6 years, a territorial arrangement that existed because both sides understood the cost of open conflict, and because the people who had the most to lose from the conflict had strong incentives to keep the peace. Those incentives had been maintained in large part through a back-channel diplomatic arrangement that Celeste had architected in 2020, run through intermediaries that neither organization knew were hers. She had not maintained that arrangement in the last 2 weeks. "How bad?" she said. "2 of our people in Red Hook this morning," Lattimore said. "Hospital. It was a message. Salazar's responding to something. I don't know what exactly, but something changed. Some arrangement they had with us stopped working, and they moved." She understood what had stopped working. "Anyone else know you called me?" she said. "No. Keep it that way." She thought for a moment. The specific rapid calculation moment she had learned to trust, the place where 12 years of structural knowledge produced answers faster than conscious reasoning could explain. The arrangement with Salazar ran through a company called Meridian Advisory Group. The contact person is a woman named Su-Lin Park. If Roman's people can reach her in the next 24 hours and confirm that the arrangement is still being honored on your side, Salazar will stand down. Bospars. Is it being honored? Celeste was quiet for a moment. Tell Roman that maintaining the Salazar arrangement costs him nothing at this point. Tell him it's the one piece of the diplomatic infrastructure I'm willing to leave intact if he reaches out to Park directly. Why? Because 2 men in the hospital is a problem. A full Salazar incursion is a catastrophe, and I don't need that kind of chaos in this city right now. A pause. You're protecting him. I'm protecting the city's structural stability, she said, which I've been doing for 12 years. Old habits. She hung up. She sat in the office for a long moment. The Salazar problem was the first thing that had given her genuine pause. Not because she felt responsible for the men in the hospital. Their presence in Red Hook, at that time, doing whatever they'd been doing, was not her fault, was not a consequence she'd designed, but because it was evidence of something she had understood theoretically and was now beginning to see in concrete form. The empire she had built didn't just sustain Roman. It sustained a structure of relationships and arrangements and negotiated stabilities that extended far beyond any single organization. Removing herself from that structure had consequences she'd calculated as acceptable. She was revising that calculation in real time, not reversing it, revising it. There was a difference. She pulled up her contacts and found Su-Lin Park's information. She stared at it for a long time. Then she made a different call. Vanessa came to the Axiom offices on Wednesday evening unannounced. Dara buzzed Celeste with a tone she'd learned to associate with situations that didn't fit any established category. "There's a woman here who says her name is Vanessa Hartwell. She doesn't have an appointment. She's asking to see you." Celeste was quiet for a moment. "Send her in." Vanessa looked different than she had at the Meridian Hotel, not less beautiful. She was still objectively beautiful, in the same structural way she had always been. But something had gone out of the performance quality that had characterized her at the gala. She was dressed well, but simply. She had the look of a woman who had spent a weekend discovering things and hadn't yet figured out how to incorporate what she'd learned into the way she presented herself to the world. She stopped inside the doorway of Celeste's office and looked at the room, the desk, the files, the view. "You've had this the whole time," she said. "Yes." Vanessa came and sat in the chair Marco Reyes had sat in 6 days ago. She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at her own hands. "He's scared," she said. "I know. I've never seen him scared before. I didn't—" She stopped. "I didn't know he could look like that." Celeste said nothing. "The men who came to the house on Sunday," Vanessa said. "His people. They weren't talking to him. They were talking around him, looking for, I don't know, looking for whoever had the answers. And he didn't—" She stopped again. "He didn't have them," Celeste said. "No." Celeste looked at her. A woman who had walked onto a stage without understanding the play, had said her lines, and was now standing in the wreckage of the third act wondering how the script had gotten away from her. She didn't feel contempt for Vanessa. She felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was a muted, complicated version of recognition. She had also once been a woman who didn't fully understand the room she was in. The difference was that she had learned. "What do you want, Vanessa?" she said. Vanessa looked up. Her eyes were steady, which Celeste respected. "I want to understand what I walked into." "You walked into a marriage that looked like a man's empire and was actually a woman's architecture," Celeste said. "You wanted the crown. You didn't ask who built the kingdom." Vanessa absorbed this. "Can you stop it? What's happening to him?" Celeste looked at her for a long moment. "No," she said, "but you could." "I could intervene in specific elements," Celeste said. "I already have, in one. The rest of it is the natural consequence of structures that were never as stable as they appeared, without the invisible work that made them look that way." She paused. "I'm not destroying him, Vanessa. I'm simply not saving him. That's a different thing." Vanessa looked at her. Something moved through her expression, not understanding exactly, but the beginning of understanding, which was different and in some ways harder. "He's going to go to prison," Vanessa said. Celeste didn't answer, which was, in its own way, an answer. Vanessa stood. She smoothed her jacket in the automatic gesture of a person gathering themselves. She looked at Celeste one more time with an expression that had lost most of the architecture of the woman who had walked up to her on the balcony at the Meridian Hotel and said, "You're a prop." "I'm sorry," Vanessa said, "for what I said at the gala." Celeste looked at her. "I know." Vanessa left. Celeste sat in the office after she'd gone and listened to the building, the particular Thursday evening quiet of an office after hours, the hum of the HVAC, the distant sound of the city beyond the glass. She thought about what Lattimore had told her, about the Salazar situation, about the call she hadn't made yet to Sulin Park. She thought about Marco Reyes and the 3 families who were asking about her. She thought about the Tokyo call and the Mercer proposal and the 6 client files on her desk that represented, in aggregate, the legitimate forward motion of the company she'd built. And she thought about the federal investigation that was, even now, working its way through the documentation that 3 years of careful protection had kept buried. She had told herself 11 months ago when she began designing this sequence that the investigation was a consequence she had accepted, that Roman's legal exposure was his responsibility, built from his choices over 12 years, and that her withdrawal of protection was not an act of aggression, but a cessation of extraordinary and uncredited maintenance. She still believed that. But sitting in the office, she understood something she hadn't fully understood before. The investigation wasn't going to stop at Roman. She had known this intellectually. She had structured her own exposure carefully, had maintained legal distance, had built Axiom's operations with clean separation. But there were people in that investigation file whose names were connected to hers in ways that were explainable and legal and would nonetheless require explanation. There were transactions in that record that would surface her involvement in Roman's financial architecture in ways she had planned to manage through the political contacts she'd withdrawn. She had withdrawn those contacts. The management she'd planned was no longer in place. She pulled up her laptop. She opened a file she had not opened since she built it, 4 years ago as a contingency, a document that was, in its function, a comprehensive reconstruction of her own legal exposure. Every point of contact between her work and Roman's operation, every transaction, every structure, cross-referenced against applicable law, annotated with the protective arrangements she'd maintained and the ones she no longer had access to. She began to read. By the time she reached page 14, she understood that the sequence she'd set in motion was not, as she had constructed it in her mind, a clean extraction. It was a controlled demolition. And she was standing inside the building. She read until midnight. The office had gone completely quiet around her by 10, the building's HVAC cycling down to its nighttime rhythm, the elevator stopping its movement between floors, the ambient sound of Park Avenue South reducing itself to the occasional cab, and the distant compression of the city settling into itself. She had turned off the overhead lights an hour in and was working by the desk lamp, which threw a specific cone of yellow light across the pages and left the rest of the office in the kind of darkness that made a person aware of the size of the room around them. Page 14 had been the beginning. By page 22, she understood the shape of the problem. By page 31, she understood it was worse than the shape suggested. The issue was not her direct legal exposure. She had structured that carefully, had maintained the separation between Axiom's operations and Roman's with the same precision she brought to everything, and that separation would hold under examination. The issue was a secondary layer, a series of transactions between 2019 and 2021 in which Celeste had functioned as a de facto intermediary between Roman's financial structure and 3 legitimate financial institutions. Transactions that were legal, that had been structured legally, that had passed compliance review at the time, but that were connected to funds whose origin the federal investigation was now in the process of characterizing as criminal proceeds. She had not moved dirty money. She had moved money whose dirtiness had not yet been established at the time she moved it. The distinction was legally significant. It was also the kind of distinction that required explanation in front of a grand jury, and grand jury explanations required the political protection she had withdrawn. She closed the laptop. She sat in the dark for a long time. The things she had not fully calculated, the thing she was sitting with now in the quiet of the office at midnight, with the city outside the window doing its indifferent thing, was that the architecture she had built to protect Roman had not been separable from herself in every dimension she'd assumed. She had built it. She was woven into it. You could not remove the architect from the building and have the building simply cease to implicate the architect. She had known this intellectually. She had not known it the way she knew it now, at midnight, reading page 31. She picked up her phone. She looked at the screen for a moment. Then she dialed a number she had not dialed in 3 years. It rang 6 times before a man answered. "Celeste Voss," the man said. Not a question. He had caller ID and he had her number, and the fact that he answered, rather than sending it to voicemail, was itself information. "Garrett," she said. Garrett Finch had been a federal prosecutor for 11 years before moving to private practice, where he ran a boutique firm that handled exactly the category of problem she was currently holding. She had cultivated him over 4 years, beginning with a referral that looked like networking and functioning as the second layer of the contingency planning she had never expected to need. "I need a meeting," she said. "When?" "Tomorrow morning, early." A pause. She could hear him recalibrating, adjusting the architecture of his Friday to accommodate this. 7:30, my office. "Thank you," she said. She hung up. She sat for another moment in the quiet dark. Then she closed the contingency document, shut the laptop, turned off the desk lamp, and sat in the complete darkness of the office for exactly 3 minutes. She gave herself 3 minutes to feel what this actually felt like. The first genuine fear she had experienced since the sequence began, clean and cold and specific, the fear of a person who has calculated carefully and discovered a gap in the calculation. Not panic. She did not do panic, but fear, which was useful information if you treated it as information rather than weather. 3 minutes. Then she stood up, got her coat, and went home. Garrett Finch's office was in a building on Lexington that announced nothing about itself from the outside. The lobby was marble and tasteful. His suite on the 9th floor had the specific quality of rooms designed to communicate calm to people who were not calm. Good furniture, no sharp angles, a particular quality of morning light from the east-facing windows. He was already there when she arrived at 7:28. He was 54, gray at the temples, wearing the Friday version of his professional presentation. Still a suit, but slightly less formal than his courtroom register. He had the face of a man who had spent decades in rooms with people who were frightened, and who had learned that the most valuable thing he could offer was steadiness. He did not offer her coffee. He had learned at some point in their acquaintance that she didn't want the social scaffolding. She sat down and opened the contingency document on her laptop and turned it toward him. "The Harmon investigation," she said. "These are the transactions I'm concerned about." He read in silence. He read the way she read, completely, without visible reaction, processing rather than performing processing. After 12 minutes, he looked up. "The 2019 transfers," he said. "Yes. These are all documented as legitimate at the time of execution." "They are." "The compliance records exist." "They do." He looked at her. "Then the exposure is manageable." "Under normal circumstances," she said. He held her gaze. He understood what normal circumstances meant in this context. He had been a federal prosecutor. He understood what the withdrawal of political protection meant for the manageability of a legal situation. "What did you withdraw?" 3 DOJ contacts, a procedural arrangement affecting the Harmon case's sealed status, and a congressional relationship that had been producing friction in the investigation's resource allocation for 2 years. He looked at her for a moment that stretched. "You withdrew all of that at once, over the course of a week." "Celeste." He said her name with a flatness that was not reproach, but was adjacent to it. The voice of a careful man who had just seen something that concerned him. "I know," she said. "The combination of those withdrawals, I know, creates a window in which investigators gain access to records that establish your involvement in the financial structure before your legal separation from it is fully—" "I know, Garrett." She said it without heat. "That's why I'm here." He closed the laptop. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "I need 3 things," she said. "I need to understand my actual exposure, not the theoretical exposure. I need a contact at the DOJ who can tell me where the Harmon investigation is directionally without alerting anyone that I'm asking. And I need to know whether there's a version of this in which I get ahead of it on my own terms." "Getting ahead of it on your own terms," he said carefully, "typically involves a conversation with prosecutors." "I know what it involves. It also typically involves—" He stopped. "Cooperation," she said. "Yes." The words sat between them. She had spent 12 years building an architecture specifically designed so that this word would never apply to her. Cooperation meant Roman. Cooperation meant naming names that were already known, but providing the evidentiary substance that transformed known names into prosecutable cases. It meant becoming, in the language of federal law, a material witness. She had built the entire axiom structure, the entire extraction from Roman's world, the entire sequence of the last 2 weeks, around the premise that she would never need to be in this room having this conversation. "Tell me the actual exposure first," she said, "before anything else." He nodded. He pulled a legal pad toward him and uncapped a pen. "Walk me through the 2019 transactions in detail." She did. She was back in the Axiom offices by 10. She sat at her desk and looked at the Park Avenue South view that she had looked at for 3 years. The view that represented, in her internal geography, the forward motion she had built for herself and by herself. Garrett's assessment had been precise and not comforting. Her exposure was real, not catastrophic, not in the way of someone who would go to prison absent extraordinary intervention, but real enough to require management. Real enough to require the kind of management that carried its own costs. If the Harmon investigation proceeded at its current trajectory, if the grand jury was impaneled within the time frame Garrett estimated, she would have a window of approximately 3 weeks in which to establish her position before the investigation's direction became fixed. 3 weeks. She was thinking about what 3 weeks meant in practical terms when Dara knocked and opened the door simultaneously, which was the second time Dara had done this in 2 weeks, which meant Celeste needed to recalibrate what the knock and enter meant, because it was becoming a signal for something. "There's a man downstairs," Dara said. "He says his name is Vincent Cole. He says you'll know who that is. Celeste went still in a way that was not visible from across the desk. She knew who Vincent Cole was. Everyone in the specific world she had inhabited for 12 years knew who Vincent Cole was, the same way you knew about certain weather systems, not personally, not directly, but as a feature of the landscape you operated in. Vincent Cole was the senior investigator for the Harmon Task Force. He was not here to introduce himself. "Send him up," she said. She had exactly 90 seconds before the elevator reached her floor. She used them to close 2 tabs on her laptop, lock the lower left drawer of her desk, and compose her expression into the specific register she used for high-stakes meetings. Present, attentive, communicating nothing. Vincent Cole was 50, built like a man who had played football in a previous decade and retained the structural memory of it in his shoulders. He wore a suit that fit well enough to be deliberate. He had the eyes of an investigator, not aggressive, not performing aggression, but the constant low-level reading of everything in the room, the professional habit of information collection that never fully turned off. He sat down without being asked. She let him. "Ms. Voss," he said. "Mr. Cole, you're aware of the Harmon investigation." "I'm aware of it." "Your name has appeared in documentation that the investigation has recently gained access to." She held his gaze, said nothing. "We're at a stage," he said, "where the direction of the investigation will be significantly shaped by the next few conversations we have with the relevant parties." He paused. "I wanted to have this conversation with you before that direction became fixed." "That's considerate of you," she said. Something moved through his expression, not quite amusement, but its structural neighbor. "Ms. Voss, I've been working financial crime for 22 years. I've read every document connected to Roman Devereaux's operation that we currently have access to. And I've spent the last week developing a fairly comprehensive picture of the architecture of that operation." He paused. "The picture is interesting." She waited. "What's interesting," he said, "is that it's the most sophisticated financial architecture I've encountered in 22 years. The layering, the legal structural separation, the political integration." He looked at her directly. "It's not the architecture of a criminal organization. It's the architecture of someone who understood both criminal organizations and legitimate finance well enough to build something that interfaced with both." She said nothing. "Roman Devereaux is not that person," Cole said. "We both know that." The office was very quiet. "I'm listening," she said finally. "We want Roman," Cole said. "We have sufficient evidence for indictment. What we want is the evidentiary foundation that makes the case prosecutable beyond reasonable doubt, the financial structure that connects his operation to the underlying criminal activity." He paused. "You built that structure. You understand it better than anyone alive. And you're currently in a position where your own exposure, while manageable in the abstract, is considerably less manageable given the specific circumstances of the last 2 weeks." She looked at him. "You know about the withdrawals," she said. "We noticed," he said, "when certain frictions in the investigation's progress suddenly resolved themselves." He met her eyes. "We're investigators, Ms. Voss. When obstacles disappear, we ask what changed." She understood then, with a clarity that was almost physical, what the last 2 weeks had looked like from the outside. She had withdrawn the protections. She had done it deliberately, as part of a sequence designed to allow the investigation to proceed naturally. She had not considered, had genuinely not fully considered, that the precise timing and specificity of those withdrawals would be itself a signal. That investigators watching an investigation suddenly accelerate would look for the mechanism, and had found her. "What you're describing," she said, "is cooperation." "I'm describing a conversation," Cole said. "What that conversation leads to depends on the conversation." She looked at her desk, at the laptop, at the window behind it. She thought about Garrett's 3-week window. She thought about the contingency document on page 31. She thought about 12 years of invisible work, and Axiom, and the Tokyo Call, and Marco Reyes, and the Mercer proposal, and everything she had built in the space between what the world saw and what was actually true. And then something happened that she had not planned for. Her phone rang. The second phone. The Android in the locked drawer. The phone that had 3 contacts. The phone that almost no one had the number for. The phone she had used to initiate the sequence on the night of the gala. It rang. Cole's eyes went to the drawer. She held herself still. She did not reach for it. She let it ring 4 times and go to a voicemail function that didn't retain messages. "Excuse me for one moment," she said. Cole nodded. She stood, walked to the window, and looked out at Park Avenue South with her back to him. She did not take the phone out. She stood at the window and thought very quickly about who had that number. 3 people. M. Aldrich, Petra Vaughn. M had initiated the sequence. Aldrich had handled Vienna. Petra had executed the dissolution documents. None of them had reason to call that phone. None of them would call that phone unless something had gone wrong in a way that required immediate contact. She turned back to Cole. "I need 48 hours, she said. He looked at her. "For what?" "To understand the full scope of what I'm being asked to contribute to," she said. "And to consult with my attorney." A pause. He was reading her. She could feel it, the professional assessment running across every micro-expression she was producing. She kept her face in the register she'd composed it in. 48 hours, he said. "Then we have this conversation again." He stood. He handed her a card. She took it. He left. She waited 30 seconds after the elevator sound. Then she unlocked the drawer, took out the phone, and checked the missed call. It was not M. It was not Aldrich. It was not Petra. It was a number she did not recognize, a number that should not have existed in any record connected to this phone, because this phone's number had never been given to anyone outside the 3 contacts, had never been used in any communication that could surface it, had never been connected to any account or identity that traced back to Celeste Voss or Celeste Devereaux. She stared at the number. Then she did something she had not done in 12 years of careful, deliberate, precision-oriented operation. She called it back without thinking it through first. It rang once. "I was wondering when you'd call back," a woman said. The voice was familiar in a way that took Celeste 3 seconds to place, 3 seconds during which her brain was running the recognition pattern against 12 years of faces and names and contexts and coming up with an answer that didn't make sense, that couldn't make sense, because the person this voice belonged to was, "Hello, Celeste," said the woman. It was Petra Vaughn, but it wasn't Petra Vaughn's number. "This isn't your number," Celeste said. "No," Petra said. "It isn't." A pause. "Petra?" Celeste's voice was flat, stripped of everything except the question underneath it. "How does someone I've never given this number to have this number?" A long silence. "Celeste," Petra said, and something in the way she said the name, careful, slightly weighted, the voice of a person about to say something that cannot be unsaid. "We need to meet, tonight. Not at your office, somewhere I tell you." "Tell me how you have this number first." "I will," Petra said. "When we meet." Petra. Celeste. The careful wait again. "What I need to tell you cannot be said on a phone, not this phone, not any phone." A pause. "It changes everything. I need you to trust me for 4 more hours." Celeste stood in the middle of her office with the phone pressed against her ear and felt something she identified with cold precision as the specific sensation of a structure she had believed to be solid, revealing, for the first time, that it had a foundation she had not examined. "Where?" she said. Petra gave her an address in the West Village. A restaurant she knew. Small, private, the kind of place that understood discretion as a business model. 8 o'clock, Petra said. "I'll be there." She hung up. She stood in the office. Outside, the November afternoon was doing what it did. And the city was doing what it did. And somewhere in the machinery of the last 2 weeks, the sequence she had designed and executed with the precision of 12 years of practice, something was wrong in a way she could not yet name. She thought about Cole, about the number, about Petra's voice carrying that specific weight. She thought about the moment, 11 years ago, when she had first brought Petra Vaughn into the architecture. The referral that had looked like a favor. The way she had structured that first engagement to make herself essential to Petra in ways Petra had never quite seen the full shape of. She thought about the phrase she'd used in her own memory of that moment. Ways Petra had never quite seen the full shape of. And for the first time, she allowed herself to ask the question she had not asked because it had not occurred to her to ask it. What if Petra had seen the full shape? What if Petra had seen it and said nothing? What if the architecture she had built to contain and utilize Petra Vaughn had been, from some point she couldn't identify, running in? She got to the restaurant 20 minutes early, not because she was anxious, because 20 minutes early meant she could choose her seat, map the exits, watch the door, and have her back to a wall before Petra arrived. These were habits she had developed not from paranoia, but from the same structural thinking she applied to everything. Information asymmetry was power, and arriving first in a room was the cheapest form of information asymmetry available. The restaurant was called Marin's, West Village, tucked between a wine bar and a dry cleaner on a block that didn't advertise itself. 8 tables. Low light. The kind of place where the staff had cultivated not recognizing faces as a professional skill. She had been here twice before, both times for conversations that required exactly this quality of anonymity. She ordered water, sat with her back to the exposed brick wall, facing the door. She had spent the 4 hours between the call and now doing 3 things. First, she had run the unrecognized number through every reverse identification resource available to her, and she had access to resources considerably beyond what a civilian could reach, and had come up with nothing. The number was clean in the way that numbers were clean when someone had made deliberate effort to make them clean. Second, she had reviewed every document Petra Vaughn had ever prepared for her, every engagement letter, every dissolution filing, the full 6-year record of their professional relationship. Third, she had sat in the Axiom office for 30 minutes doing nothing, which was her version of the thing other people did in moments of crisis that she had never found a clean word for. Not prayer, not meditation. The act of deliberately clearing the architecture of active thought and letting the deeper pattern recognition run without interference. What the deeper pattern recognition had surfaced in those 30 minutes was not an answer. It was a shape she didn't like. Petra walked in at 8:02. She was 53, a slight woman who wore her authority in her posture rather than her presentation. She dressed simply, expensively, with the specific understatement of someone who had learned that the people she needed to impress were not impressed by display. She had silver at the temples that she'd stopped coloring 4 years ago, which Celeste had noted at the time as a decision that communicated something deliberate. She had worked with Celeste for 6 years, and in that time had always maintained a quality of professional warmth, present, engaged, specific, but with a consistent boundary that Celeste had respected, and she realized now had perhaps misread. Petra sat down. She did not look around the room. She looked directly at Celeste. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Tell me about the number," Celeste said. Petra folded her hands on the table. "I've known about the second phone for 3 years." The restaurant's ambient noise continued. Someone at the table by the window was laughing at something. "How?" Celeste said. "The building on Park Avenue South," Petra said. "The Axiom office. When you signed the lease 9 years ago, the building's IT infrastructure included a passive signal monitoring system that was," she paused, choosing the word, "accessible to someone with the right relationships." Celeste looked at her. "Who has the right relationships?" "The man who owns this building," Petra said. "His name is Lawrence Taft. You don't know him directly. He has a business relationship with Roman that predates your marriage." The shape in Celeste's mind sharpened. "Taft has been monitoring communications in and out of the Axiom offices since you signed the lease," Petra said. "Not continuously. Selectively. Flagged activity. The second phone registered as a device that powered on periodically in that space. The number was identified 18 months ago when you made a call from the office while the phone was active." "Why are you telling me this?" Celeste said. Petra was quiet for a moment. "Because Taft brought me into the arrangement 2 years ago." She held Celeste's gaze. "He wanted someone who understood the legal architecture of what you were doing, someone who could help him understand what you were building and how exposed Roman would be if you ever moved against him." The table between them was very still. "You've been working for Taft," Celeste said. "I've been working for Taft," Petra said, "for 2 years. While working for me. While working for you." Celeste looked at her hands, then back up. Her voice, when she spoke, was the flattest it had been in any conversation in recent memory. "The dissolution documents, the ones you executed Monday, were filed correctly," Petra said. "Everything I prepared for you was executed exactly as you instructed. I want you to understand that." "Then what did you give him?" Petra took a breath. "The structural map, the full architecture of everything you'd built inside Roman's operation. The beneficial ownership provisions, the control structures, the complete picture of how Axiom related to the underlying entities." She paused. He has a document that, in the wrong hands, establishes your involvement in the financial architecture far more comprehensively than anything the Harmon investigation currently has access to. The laughter from the table by the window had stopped. The wrong hands, Celeste said. Taft's attorney has a sealed copy, Petra said, with instructions to deliver it to the federal investigation if Taft determines his own interests require it. She looked at Celeste. He's been using it as insurance, not against you specifically, as part of a larger arrangement with Roman. If Roman's operation goes down in a way that exposes Taft, Taft has a document that redirects prosecutorial attention. To me, Celeste said. To the architect of the financial structure, Petra said, which is you. Celeste sat with this. She sat with it in the specific way she sat with information that required structural reorganization, not emotionally, not yet, but architecturally, rearranging the picture she'd been working from to incorporate the new element, examining how it changed the load-bearing relationships. It changed almost everything. The 3-week window Garrett had described was not 3 weeks. It was however long Taft decided his interests were safe. The moment Roman's collapse reached a point where Taft's own exposure became critical, and that moment, given the current trajectory of the Harmon investigation, was not 3 weeks away, but possibly days away. Taft would hand the document to federal investigators, and Celeste's carefully structured legal separation from Roman's operation would be buried under a comprehensive architectural map that told a very different story. "Why are you telling me this?" Celeste said again. The second time asking meant something different than the first. Petra looked at her for a long moment. "Because I've worked with you for 6 years," she said. "And because what Taft did, what he asked me to help him do, is not something I was fully informed about when I agreed to it. The use he's planning to make of that document is not what I understood to be the arrangement." She paused. "And because you deserve to know." "You could have told me 2 years ago," Celeste said. "Yes." "You could have told me at any point." "Yes." The single syllable had the quality of a person who had rehearsed the conversation and reached the place where rehearsal ran out. Celeste looked at her. "Where is Taft right now?" "His office. He works late on Fridays." "Where's the document?" "His attorney's office. A man named Bryson, on the 42nd floor of 1221 Avenue of the Americas. The sealed copy is in a physical file." She paused. "There's also a digital version." "Encrypted?" "Presumably." Celeste looked at her watch. 8:19. She thought about Cole's 48 hours. She thought about the Harmon investigation's current trajectory. She thought about the specific convergence of timelines that she was now inside. Roman's collapse accelerating, Taft's exposure increasing, Cole waiting for a conversation, and a document in a sealed file that could rewrite the story of the last 12 years in a way that made her the architect of a criminal empire rather than the woman who had built something extraordinary inside one and then walked away. "Taft," she said. "Does Roman know about him?" "Roman knows Taft as a property owner with a business relationship," Petra said. "He doesn't know about the monitoring arrangement. He doesn't know Taft has the document. So Taft is not acting on Roman's behalf." "No. Taft is acting entirely on his own behalf. Roman is a liability to him at this point. If Roman goes down cleanly, pleads, cooperates minimally, takes a sentence, Taft is fine. If the investigation expands, if Roman starts looking for deals to make, if prosecutors start pulling threads that lead toward the property holdings," she stopped. "Taft needs a redirect," Celeste said. You're the redirect." Celeste stood up. Petra looked up at her. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to handle it," Celeste said. "That's what I do." She left $40 on the table for the water she hadn't drunk and walked out into the West Village night. The cold hit her face and she walked without stopping, moving east, her phone already out. She called Garrett first. He answered on the second ring. "It's almost 9 on a Friday." "Lawrence Taft," she said. "Property developer, building holdings in Midtown and Lower Manhattan. Tell me his legal exposure in the Harmon investigation." A pause. "Where are you getting—" "Garrett, his exposure." She heard him moving, the sound of a chair, footsteps, the quality of the line changing as he walked somewhere more private. "Taft has 3 buildings with commercial tenants connected to the Harmon investigation. His exposure is indirect but real. If the investigation characterizes rental income from those tenants as proceeds adjacent, it's substantial, she said. It could be. He has a document, she said. A structural map of the Devereaux financial architecture that he obtained through illegal monitoring of a leased commercial space. If he delivers it to Cole's team, it redirects attention toward me and away from his own property holdings. A silence. Celeste, I need to know two things. Whether illegally obtained documentation is admissible in the context of a grand jury proceeding, and what the exposure is for Taft if the illegal monitoring is established. She could hear Garrett thinking. Illegally obtained documentation, there are paths to exclusion, but it's not automatic in a grand jury context. The standards are different than trial. If the monitoring violated federal wiretapping statutes, the building is in New York. The monitoring was passive signal capture. That's a federal question and a state question simultaneously. The answer is that the document's admissibility would be contested, it would not be automatically excluded, and the fight to exclude it would take time that I don't have, she said. Taft's exposure if the monitoring is established, Garrett said carefully, is significant. Federal wiretapping carries substantial penalties. The civil liability alone is enough, she said. Enough for what? Enough for a conversation, she said. Get me Taft's attorney's home number. His name is Bryson. He's at 1221 Avenue of the Americas. Celeste, it's 9 o'clock on a Friday. Garrett. She stopped walking. She was standing on a corner in the West Village with the cold November night around her and the specific quality of focus that she had always been able to produce in genuine crisis. Not calm exactly. Something more like the absolute compression of everything irrelevant until only the necessary remained. I have possibly 48 hours before a document surfaces that rewrites 12 years of my life. I need Bryson's number. I need it now. A pause. Give me 10 minutes. She kept walking. Some. Taft's office was on the 31st floor of a building on 6th Avenue, and she was there by 9:40. She had not called ahead. She had not announced herself. She had walked into the lobby with the specific quality of a person who belongs in a building and told the security desk that she was there to see Lawrence Taft, that he was expecting her, that she was a business associate, and she had stood with the composed authority of someone for whom being believed was a default setting. The security desk called upstairs, held for 30 seconds, waved her through. Taft's assistant, a young man working late on a Friday for reasons that probably had something to do with fear, showed her to a corner office and said Mr. Taft would be with her in a moment. Taft appeared 2 minutes later. He was 61, a large man, the physical presence of someone who had played a sport seriously in a previous life and had maintained the structural memory of it without maintaining the conditioning. He had a politician's face, open, approachable, the face of someone who had learned early that likability was an asset in every room. He looked at her with the specific expression of a man who recognized a face and was running the recognition against his internal register. Ms. Voss, she said. Celeste Voss. You know who I am. He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in the open, approachable face, not dramatically, but the specific micro-adjustment of a man recalculating the nature of a situation. He closed the office door. Sit down, he said. I'll stand, she said. This won't take long. He looked at her. How did you get up here? The same way I've gotten into every room I've ever needed to be in, she said. I asked. He moved to his desk but didn't sit, kept the desk between them. Physical architecture as communication, the same language she used. What do you want? I want the document, she said, the one your attorney is holding, and I want the digital version, destroyed. He looked at her with an expression that was attempting blankness but not fully achieving it. I don't know what document. Lawrence! She said his name with the same flat register she used when the social scaffolding was not something she had time for. The monitoring arrangement in the building on Park Avenue South. The structural map your attorney is holding in a sealed file on the 42nd floor of 1221 Avenue of the Americas. The digital backup. She looked at him steadily. I know about all of it. I've known for approximately 2 hours. Let's not use this conversation on pretending otherwise. The blankness gave up. What replaced it was something more honest and more dangerous. The expression of a man assessing a threat in real time, calculating whether he was holding more than she was. You can't prove the monitoring, he said. I can establish it, she said. Technically, forensically, through the building's IT infrastructure. Not instantly, not tonight, but within a time frame considerably shorter than the Harmon investigation's current trajectory. She paused. Federal wiretapping, Lawrence, that's not a civil matter. Neither is building a criminal empire's financial architecture, he said. His voice had hardened. The politician's face had gone somewhere else. What was left was the version of him that had gotten to a 31st floor corner office on 6th Avenue, which was not the approachable version. I built a financial architecture, she said. I built it legally, using legitimate instruments, on behalf of a client whose underlying activities were his own. I'm an architect who designed a building. I'm not responsible for what someone put in the rooms. That argument works better if you weren't married to him for 12 years. My personal relationship with my client doesn't change the legal analysis of my professional work. She held his gaze. But your unauthorized electronic surveillance of a commercial tenant changes the legal admissibility of the document you've been using as insurance. Courts have inconsistent standards on this question. Yes, she said. You'd like to test that inconsistency. So would I. The difference is that the admissibility fight happens in a context where the monitoring itself is also being prosecuted, and you're the subject of that prosecution. She paused. We can both spend the next 18 months in a legal war that is expensive and exhausting and ends with a judge ruling on which piece of inadmissible evidence is more inadmissible than the other. Or we can have a different conversation. He looked at her. What kind of conversation? The kind where we recognize that your actual problem isn't me, she said. Your actual problem is that the Harmon investigation is expanding toward your property holdings. And the document you've been holding as insurance against that expansion is about to become a liability rather than an asset because the person it's meant to redirect has already initiated contact with the investigation on her own terms. Something shifted in his face. She watched it shift. You've talked to Cole. Cole came to me, she said. Yesterday. I have 48 hours to determine my position. She let that sit. If I determine my position before you deliver that document, the document becomes evidence of illegal surveillance with no prosecutorial value. You get the exposure without the protection. He was quiet. She could hear him breathing, the specific sound of a man whose calculation had just changed. What do you want from me? He said. The hard edges had not left his voice, but something behind them had shifted. The recognition that the conversation had a possible conclusion other than confrontation. I want the document destroyed, she said. Physical and digital. Tonight. I want Bryson notified by you, personally, before I leave this building. She paused. In exchange, my cooperation with the Harmon investigation focuses on Roman's operational structure. Your property holdings are not my area of knowledge. I can't speak to what I don't know. He looked at her for a long time. You can actually do that, he said. Scope your cooperation. I'm cooperating with an investigation into a criminal organization, she said. I know the financial architecture of that organization. I don't know the property holdings of every business associate who leased space in buildings Roman's people frequented. She held his gaze. That's a factually accurate statement. The office was very quiet. Taft moved to his desk. He picked up his phone. He dialed. She listened to the one-sided conversation, Taft's voice stripped of its politician quality, compressed into the blunt syllables of a man handling a problem. She heard Bryson's name. She heard the instruction to open the file. She heard the instruction to destroy it. She heard the resistance from Bryson's end, and then Taft's voice going flat in a way that ended the resistance. He hung up. He looked at her. The digital version requires access to a secure server, he said. It'll take until tomorrow morning. I'll have someone verify it tomorrow morning, she said. He nodded. She turned to leave. Miss Voss? His voice stopped her at the door. She turned. You built that entire thing yourself, the architecture, all of it. She looked at him. Roman Devereaux had no idea what he had, Taft said. It wasn't admiration exactly. It was something more complicated. The assessment of a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where power was the primary currency looking at something he'd tried to use as a tool and was only now understanding the full dimensions of. She looked at him for a moment. No, she said. He didn't. She left. The elevator took forever. She stood in it and felt for the first time since the second phone had rung in her office that afternoon the full weight of what her body had been carrying for the last 6 hours. Her shoulders, the specific tightness at the base of her neck that she associated with sustained high-intensity focus. Her hands, which were completely steady, they were always completely steady, but which she was aware of in a way she wasn't usually aware of her hands. The lobby, the revolving door, the cold. She stood on 6th Avenue at 10:17 at night and pulled in a breath of November air and let it out slowly. Her phone rang. "Garrett. Bryson called me," he said. 11 minutes ago, said his client had instructed destruction of a sealed file and wanted a witness. I sent my associate." A pause. "What did you do?" "Handled it," she said. "Celeste. Garrett, I need you to call Cole tomorrow morning. I want to move the conversation up, before the 48 hours. A long pause. "You've decided." "I've decided," she said. "Cooperating with a federal investigation against your husband. Former husband," she said. "And yes, on my terms, within a defined scope, with full legal protection for Axiom and all current operations." She paused. "That's the conversation. Can you have it ready by 9 tomorrow?" "I can," he said, quietly, with something in the quiet that she didn't have the bandwidth to examine right now. She hung up. She looked up at the 6th Avenue Canyon, the buildings on both sides throwing light up into the overcast November sky, the city doing its relentless, indifferent thing around her, the traffic and the cold, and the specific New York Friday night energy of 10,000 separate stories happening simultaneously in all directions. She started walking. She had made it half a block when her regular phone rang. "Roman." She stopped. She looked at the screen. She answered. "I know you talked to Taft," Roman said. His voice was different than it had been in the kitchen, different than it had been in her office. Stripped of the calibrating quality, stripped of the performed authority. What was left was something rawer, more fundamental. The voice of a man who had spent a week watching the ground disappear from beneath him and had just gotten one more piece of information confirming the direction of the fall. "Roman, Cole came to see me today," he said. "This afternoon. Told me the investigation had accelerated. Told me they'd be seeking indictment within 2 weeks." A pause. "He told me they had a cooperating witness." She said nothing. "Was that you?" Roman said. Have you already been talking to them?" "I've had one conversation," she said. "Preliminary. Nothing has been agreed to. But it will be." She looked at the pavement in front of her, at the specific gray of a New York sidewalk at night, the particular texture of it, unremarkable and solid. "Yes," she said. "It will be." The silence on the line had a weight to it she hadn't heard from him before. Not anger, not the calculated power silence he deployed in rooms. Something simpler and older. The silence of a man who had run out of moves. 12 years, he said. 12 years, she said, and it ends like this. She thought about the ballroom, about the specific quality of his stillness when Vanessa had walked across the marble floor, about the nothing he had said when she needed him to say something, about page 31 of a contingency document she had built against a possibility she had told herself she'd never need. "It ends," she said, "the way things end when they've been wrong for a long time." She heard him breathing. "The attorneys," he said. "The name you offered. I need it." She stopped walking. She looked up at the buildings around her, at the November sky above them, at the city that had been the context of 12 years of the most extraordinary work she had ever done. Work that had been invisible and unrecognized and was about to become, in the specific light of a federal courtroom, a record that would define how the world understood. She gave Roman the name. Standing on 6th Avenue at 10:20 in the night, with the cold working through her coat and the city indifferent around her, she read him the name and number of the best criminal defense attorney she knew. A woman named Sandra Reeves, who had spent 20 years doing the kind of work that required both brilliance and a specific tolerance for moral complexity, and who had, in Celeste's assessment, the particular combination of skills that Roman's situation demanded. She read the number out loud. Roman wrote it down. She heard the scratch of a pen. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, stripped of everything. No performance, no calibration, no attempt to find the angle. Just the two words in the voice of a man who had nothing left to perform for. "Don't thank me," she said. "Use her." She hung up. She stood on the sidewalk for another moment. Then she hailed a cab and went home. The Midtown apartment, not Westchester, because Westchester was a version of her life that was finished, and she had understood this fact intellectually for 2 weeks, and was only now standing in the lobby of the building that had been her private geography for 9 years, understanding it in the way that the body understood things differently than the mind. She rode the elevator up. She unlocked the door. She stood in the apartment in her coat for a full minute before she took it off. Man, the morning came gray and cold, and she was awake before it, sitting at the table by the window with coffee she'd made at 5:30, watching the sky above Midtown shift through its colorless gradations from dark to the particular flat November light that offered no warmth. She had slept 4 hours, cleanly, without the fractured half-consciousness she'd expected. The body knew when a decision had been made and stopped fighting it. At 8:15, she called Garrett. 9 o'clock holds, he said when he answered. Cole agreed to move it up. He said, a pause. He said he wasn't surprised. No, she said. I don't imagine he was. She dressed carefully. Not the performance of the Meridian Hotel, not the midnight blue gown selected for what it communicated at a charity gala. She dressed in the register of the Axiom offices. Good, precise, understated. The clothes of a woman who was not making an argument with her appearance because she didn't need to. The argument was going to be made in a room on the 14th floor of a building on Lexington Avenue, in the language she'd been fluent in her entire life, which was the language of structure and architecture and the precise placement of information. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment, not for reassurance, just to see what was there. What was there was a woman who was 40 years old and looked it in the specific way of people who have spent their lives using their minds at full capacity, not aged, not tired, but marked by the particular kind of experience that left traces that couldn't be mistaken for anything except what they were. She picked up her bag. She went to work. Eat. The meeting with Cole lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. Garrett was present. Cole brought a second investigator, Sutz, a woman named Tran, who handled the financial documentation and who asked the most precise questions of anyone in the room. A federal prosecutor named Whitfield sat in for the final 90 minutes, which was the portion of the conversation in which the actual scope and terms of her cooperation were established. Celeste spoke in the same register she used for everything. Complete, accurate, precisely bounded. She described the financial architecture she had built. She described the structures, the instruments, the political relationships, the legal mechanisms that had constituted the invisible backbone of Roman's operation for 12 years. She described it not as a confession and not as a performance, but as a professional giving a technical account of work she had done, which was what it was. She did not describe Lawrence Taft's property holdings. She did not describe Marco Reyes's intermediary relationships. She described what she knew of her own construction, the things she had built, the architecture that was genuinely hers to describe because she had genuinely built it. Whitfield at one point asked about Axiom Strategic Consulting and its relationship to the underlying structures. Garrett answered before she could, precisely and correctly, establishing the legal separation and independence of Axiom's operations in terms that Whitfield accepted without further pressure. She watched Garrett handle it and felt something she recognized as gratitude, which she filed away to examine later. At the end of the meeting, Whitfield indicated that the scope of cooperation was acceptable, that the evidentiary value of what she had provided was significant, that in exchange for full documentation of the architectural details she had described, and availability for testimony if the case proceeded to trial, her own exposure in the Harmon investigation would be managed through a non-prosecution agreement. She had not gone to prison. She had not destroyed herself. She had walked into a room and described what she had built, and in describing it had given federal investigators the clearest picture they'd ever had of how Roman Devereaux's operation had actually functioned, and she had walked out of that room with her company intact and her freedom intact and the forward motion of her life, which she had spent 12 years constructing in the space between what people saw and what was actually true, entirely her own. She stood in the lobby of Garrett's building afterward and felt the cold air from the revolving door moving across her face each time someone entered or exited. Garrett stood beside her. Well, he said. Well, she said. Axiom is clean, he said. The non-prosecution agreement is solid. Whitfield is thorough, but he's not going to find anything in the documentation that contradicts what you told him. No, she said, he won't. Garrett looked at her. He had the expression of a man who had been in difficult rooms for a long time and had developed a specific kind of regard for people who navigated those rooms with the particular combination of skill and composure she demonstrated this morning. What happens now? She looked at the revolving door, at the November street beyond it, at the city that had been her context for 16 years, that had asked her to be invisible for 12 of them, that was in the process of being asked now to see her. Now I go to work, she said. The indictment came down on a Tuesday, 3 weeks later. She read about it the way she read about most things that moved through the news cycle in the context of her world, completely, without visible reaction, processing the information against the structural picture she already held. The indictment named Roman Devereaux on 7 counts. The press coverage was extensive. The photographs were the kind that major criminal indictments generated. Roman leaving a building with Sandra Reeves beside him, Sandra's hand on his arm in the subtle guiding gesture of an attorney managing a client through a difficult public moment. Celeste looked at the photographs for a moment. She thought about the man in those photographs. The man she had met at 24 who had large hands and a particular quality of stillness she had confused, briefly, for depth. The man who had stood in the Meridian Hotel ballroom and said nothing. She thought about the 12 years. She did not think about them with grief, exactly, or with anger, exactly. She thought about them with the specific quality of attention that she brought to everything that had shaped the architecture of who she was, completely, without looking away, giving them the weight they deserved. They deserved considerable weight. She closed the browser. She pulled up the Mercer file. Petra Vaughn resigned from her firm in December. She sent Celeste a letter, actual paper, handwritten, which was a choice that communicated something, that arrived at the Axiom offices on a Wednesday afternoon. Celeste read it once at her desk. Petra said she was leaving practice. She said she was sorry. She said the sorry in the specific, non-performative way of someone who understood that sorry was inadequate and was saying it anyway because inadequate was still something. Celeste held the letter for a moment. Then she set it on her desk and wrote a response, also on paper, which she had not done in years, that was 4 sentences long. She told Petra that the documents she had prepared over 6 years were accurate and professional. She told Petra that her behavior over the last 2 years was not something she intended to spend further time on. She told Petra that she hoped she found work that suited her. She told her good luck. She meant all 4 sentences. She sealed the envelope and gave it to Dara to mail. Marcus Webb called her in January. He had, following her advice, obtained his own attorney. He had, following that attorney's advice, cooperated with the investigation in his own limited capacity. He was not being charged. He was in the process of dismantling the professional life he had built inside Roman's organization and figuring out, at 51, what came next. He called on a Thursday morning, and she took the call because she recognized the number, and because she had, over the last 2 months, developed a different relationship with the calls she took and the ones she let go. "I need a reference," he said. When he said it, the directness of it, no preamble, no social scaffolding, just the thing he needed, reminded her of something she recognized in herself. The habit of people who have been through difficult rooms of getting to the point. "For what position?" she said. "CFO. A clean company. Midsize. I have 2 interviews." She thought for a moment. Webb was competent, had been, for 9 years, genuinely competent at the financial operations work he did. What he had lacked was judgment about context, the specific judgment that said when to leave, which was a judgment that the structure he'd been inside had not encouraged. That wasn't nothing, but it also wasn't everything. "Send me the companies," she said. "I'll decide after I've looked at them." A pause. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said. She looked at both companies. She gave one reference. The mid-size company with the cleaner books and the less complicated ownership structure. She wrote 3 paragraphs about Webb's financial capabilities and 1 sentence about the importance of professional context, which was as close as a reference letter could get to what she actually wanted to say, which was, He does good work when he's in a room that deserves it. She heard later that he got the position. The Axiom offices expanded in February. She leased the 16th floor in addition to the 14th and 15th, added 7 people to a staff that now numbered 19, and formalized 2 client relationships that had been operating on a handshake basis since the fall. The Mercer partnership was announced in a trade publication in the second week of February, a brief, factual announcement in the language of corporate finance that nonetheless represented in her internal geography something she had been building toward for 3 years. She read the announcement in the morning before the office filled up, standing at the window with coffee, looking at the Park Avenue South view that had been her view for 3 years, and that she was now looking at from a slightly different angle because she had moved her desk 6 weeks ago. The old position had put her back to the door, which had been a deliberate choice for the years when she was operating in the space between visibility and invisibility, when having her back to the entrance of a room was a statement about where her attention was directed. She had turned the desk to face the door, the small physical adjustments that marked the end of one way of living and the beginning of another. Roman's trial began in March. She was not in the courtroom. She had given her testimony in a deposition format on camera in a conference room at Garrett's firm, with Sandra Reeves present for Roman's side and Whitfield present for the prosecution. She had answered every question she was asked accurately and completely. She had not elaborated beyond the question. She had not looked at Sandra Reeves when Sandra asked the questions that were designed to establish reasonable doubt about the architectural intent, and she had not needed to because the answers to those questions were accurate and straightforward and did not require any particular emotional management to deliver. The trial lasted 6 weeks. She did not follow it daily. She followed it in the way she followed most external events that affected her context, periodically, precisely, extracting the relevant structural information and setting aside the rest. She heard from Lattimore once, in the 4th week of the trial, a text that said simply, Salazar holding, arrangement intact, which meant that the back-channel diplomatic structure she had asked him to maintain through Sulin Park had held, which meant that whatever chaos the collapse of Roman's organization had generated, the specific territorial violence she had intervened to prevent had not escalated further. She was glad of it, not for Roman's sake, for the city's sake, for the 2 men who had ended up in a Red Hook hospital in November, and for whoever would have followed them. She texted back, "Good." She put her phone down and went back to work. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon in the last week of April. Guilty on 5 of 7 counts. She was in a client meeting when Dara knocked and entered with the expression that meant something outside the category of normal. Celeste excused herself briefly, stepped into the corridor, read the single-sentence text from Garrett. She stood in the corridor for a moment, then she went back into the meeting. She saw Roman once more. It was not planned. It was not a scene she had designed or anticipated. It was a Tuesday afternoon in May, 3 weeks before his sentencing, and she was coming out of a building on Park Avenue when she saw him on the sidewalk 40 feet ahead of her, walking with Sandra Reeves, both of them in the particular configuration of a client and attorney, moving between locations with the compressed, purposeful energy of people managing a difficult situation. He saw her. Sandra kept walking for a moment before she realized he'd stopped. Celeste stopped too. They were 40 feet apart on a Park Avenue sidewalk in May, with the city moving around them in all directions, and they looked at each other across that distance with nothing between them. No architecture, no performance, no carefully constructed presentation. Just 2 people who had known each other for 16 years, 12 of them in a specific and complicated arrangement that had produced something extraordinary and had ended in a federal courthouse. She could see, even at this distance, the specific quality of what he looked like now. Not broken. Roman was not built for broke, the same way he wasn't built for guilt, but reduced. The gravitational pull that had always surrounded him was still there in some diminished form, but the knowing had gone out of it. The certainty that the room was his to command. He looked like a man who had discovered, in the most expensive possible way, the limits of what he'd actually been. She nodded. He nodded. Sandra touched his arm, and they kept walking. Celeste stood on the sidewalk for one more moment. Then she turned and walked the other direction. She did not attend the sentencing in June. She heard the sentence from Garrett, 14 years federal, with possibility of reduction for cooperation. Sandra had done her job well. It was not a light sentence, but it was not the sentence the charges had originally supported, which meant something about the quality of the defense and about the way the prosecution had chosen to use the cooperation it had received. She heard the number, 14, and sat with it for a moment. 14 years was a long time. It was longer than she'd known him. It was longer than most things in a human life that you entered expecting to leave changed and discovered, on the other side, had changed you in ways you hadn't agreed to. She was not glad. She was not sorry either, in the way that sorry implied she would have done differently. She would not have done differently. She had built something extraordinary in a context that was wrong for her and had extracted herself from it at the cost she'd always known extracting herself would eventually carry, and the man whose collapse had been the mechanism of her extraction was in federal custody, and she was standing in an office on the 14th floor of a building on Park Avenue South on a Tuesday morning in June, with the window behind her and the door in front of her, and 19 people on 2 floors doing work that she had built the architecture for. She had not done anything easily. She had not come out of it clean in the way of people who had never been inside anything complicated. What she had come out of it as was herself. The specific, complete, fully inhabited version of herself that had existed in the space between what people saw and what was actually true for 16 years, and that was now, for the first time, occupying the same space as what people saw. That was not nothing. That was, in the accounting of her life, everything. The Hartfield Foundation Gala happened again in November, as it always did. The invitation arrived at the Axiom offices in October, not addressed to Mrs. Roman Devereaux, which had been the form of her existence in this world's social register for 12 years, but addressed to Celeste Voss, CEO, Axiom Strategic Consulting, which was a form she had not occupied at this particular event before. She looked at the invitation for a moment. Then she RSVP'd yes. The Meridian Hotel on Fifth Avenue on a November evening looked exactly as it had always looked. 40-foot ceilings, chandeliers, waitstaff with the cultivated invisibility of people trained to witness without remembering. The city's elite in black tie, performing the annual ritual of charity and proximity and the complicated social architecture of people who had accumulated enough to be in this room and were working to stay there. She wore black this year, not the midnight blue of last year. That was someone else's choice, made in the context of someone else's life. She wore black, fitted, precise, and she wore it in the specific register of someone who had not selected it for what it communicated, but because it was what she wanted to wear, which was a distinction that felt small from the outside and was enormous from the inside. She arrived alone. She had always, in the essential sense, arrived alone, but this was the first time that the aloneness was visible, which made it a different thing entirely. The room received her differently than it had last November. She noticed this without surprise. She had understood, from the first week that the Harmon investigation went public, that the social recalibration would be swift and thorough, because the rooms she moved in were composed of people who understood power and its movements with an accuracy that sentimentality could not afford. Roman's collapse had been total. Axiom survival, and not merely survival, but expansion and visibility. The trade publications, the Mercer announcement, the February profile in a financial industry newsletter that had described her in terms that bore no resemblance to any description anyone had used in public for 12 years. All of that had been processed by the room's social intelligence with the same efficiency. She was not Roman's wife. She was the person who had been behind Roman Devereaux. She was, in the language of this room, interesting in a way she had never been when she was merely his. She worked the room, not the way Roman had worked it, the gravitational pull, the crowd around him, the performance of effortless centrality. She worked it the way she did everything, methodically and with genuine engagement, moving through conversations that were real rather than theatrical, stopping to speak with people whose names were in her phone under categories that were now, for the first time, exclusively her own. She spoke with a senator from New York who had, 14 months ago, stopped answering calls from Roman's people, and who now wanted to discuss infrastructure investment and sustainable finance with the same seriousness he'd previously reserved for the connections he thought mattered. She spoke with a managing director from a fund that had been courting Axiom's advisory services for 6 months, She spoke with the foundation's director, a woman named Helen Park, who had built the Hartfield Foundation from a small family endowment into one of the city's most significant philanthropic operations, and who had the quality of intelligence that Celeste recognized and respected, the specific, grounded intelligence of someone who had spent their life doing genuine work and had no patience for the performance of it. They spoke for 20 minutes in a corner of the room while the gala moved around them, and at the end Helen said, "We should have lunch. I have a project that needs the kind of thinking I haven't been able to find." And Celeste said yes with the directness of someone who meant it. She was standing near the second-tier balcony when she became aware of being watched, not with hostility, with attention. The particular quality of observation that she associated with someone trying to decide whether to approach. She looked toward it. Vanessa Hartwell was standing 30 feet away, not in a red gown this time, in something simple and dark, which was either coincidence or its own statement. She looked like a woman who had been through a version of the last 7 months that had changed the shape of something fundamental in how she inhabited a room. The particular architecture of performed confidence that had characterized her at last year's gala was not present. What was present was something less polished and more real. She crossed the 30 feet. They stood facing each other in the same airspace where, 1 year ago, the thing had happened that had changed everything. "You came back," Vanessa said. "I was the guest of honor," Celeste said. Vanessa's mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile, the acknowledgement of the precision of it. "I almost didn't come tonight," she said. I wasn't sure whether—" She stopped, started again. "I wanted to see it." "See what?" "This." She gestured a small, careful motion that encompassed the room, the people in it, the specific social fact of where Celeste was standing and how the room had oriented itself around her. "I wanted to see what it looked like when someone who deserved the room was finally in it." Celeste looked at her. Vanessa's face had the expression of a woman who had come to say something and was saying it regardless of the cost, because the cost of not saying it was higher. "I know what I did," she said. "Not just last year, the whole thing. I walked into a situation I didn't understand, and I made it worse for a person who didn't deserve the specific kind of worse I made it. And I've thought about that." Her voice was steady, but only by effort. "I've thought about it a lot." Celeste was quiet for a moment. She thought about the woman who had said, "You're a prop in this room," 12 months ago. She thought about the woman who had come to the Axiom offices in the second week, broken and asking her to save a man who didn't want saving and didn't deserve it. She thought about the education Vanessa had gotten in the Westchester house, listening to phone calls from a world she'd never actually been part of. She thought about herself, at 24, arriving in this city with a specific and unusual set of capabilities she had not yet understood how to convert into survival. She had figured it out. So, it appeared, had Vanessa. At least the beginning of it. The figuring out. The starting place of understanding what questions to ask. "You wanted the crown," Celeste said, "without asking about the kingdom." "Yes," Vanessa said. "Now you'll ask." It wasn't a question. Vanessa looked at her and understood that it wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "Now I'll ask." Celeste nodded. She reached into her bag and took out a card. A simple card, Axiom's name and her name and a phone number. She held it out. Vanessa looked at it for a moment. Then she took it. "I'm not offering anything," Celeste said. "I'm not in the business of fixing people's professional trajectories out of the goodness of my heart, but you're clearly not stupid, and the city is full of rooms that won't tell you what they actually are until you've already walked in and sat down." She paused. "Call if you need to know what the room is before you walk in." Vanessa looked at the card, then at Celeste. Something in her expression had the quality of a person absorbing something they hadn't known they needed. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Celeste said. "Learn something." She moved away through the crowd. Later, near midnight, the gala beginning its slow dissolution into departures and last drinks, she found a moment alone on the same second-tier balcony where she had stood the year before. The ballroom below her was thinning. The chandeliers still threw their expensive light. The waitstaff moved through the diminishing crowd with their professional invisibility. The city beyond the hotel's windows did what it always did. She stood with a glass of Sancerre that she actually drank this time. She She thought about the 12 years. Not the whole weight of them. She had put the whole weight down, had been putting it down incrementally since November of last year, and she was not going to pick it back up tonight. But the specific truth of them, that they had been real, that the work had been real and extraordinary, that building something remarkable inside the wrong context was still building something remarkable, and that the building of it had made her what she was, and that what she was had survived the context. She thought about the ballroom below her and the people in it, and the fact that every single one of them had, at some point in the last 12 months, recalibrated how they understood who she was, and that not one of them knew the half of it. They knew the surface, the consulting firm, the financial architecture story, the cooperation with federal investigators, the Mercer partnership, the February profile. They knew the visible record. They did not know the second phone. They did not know the contingency document. They did not know page 31 or Taft's office on the 31st floor of 6th Avenue, or the 3 minutes of darkness in the Axiom office in November, when she had let herself feel the fear before she put it away and stood up and went home. They did not know the things that had actually cost something. That was all right. She had not built her life to be understood by rooms. She had built it to be real. She set the Sancerre down on the balcony rail. She looked at the ballroom below, the chandeliers, the thinning crowd, the city visible through the tall windows, the November night doing what November nights did in New York, which was persist, indifferent, and cold, and completely indifferent to the specific human reckoning happening inside any given building. She had been standing behind things for 16 years. Not behind the throne. That was the story people were telling now. The clean version, the version that fit in a sentence. The truth was more complicated and less dramatic and more durable than that story. The truth was that she had built an architecture that no one saw and then built another one that everyone would eventually see. And the passage from one to the other had cost her exactly what she'd known it would cost, and nothing that she hadn't been willing to pay. She was 40 years old. Axiom was growing at a rate that would require another expansion by spring. The Mercer partnership had, in its first 6 months, produced 3 sub-engagements that were each larger than anything she'd managed in her first 2 years of independent operation. Marco Reyes had come back in January with documented briefs from the Battaglia family and the OSE organization, and she had spent February reading them with the precise structural attention she brought to every assessment, and she had determined that both situations were solvable, and that solving them as the principal architect rather than the invisible backbone of someone else's operation was a different thing entirely, and that she was prepared for that difference. She had not said yes yet. She was going to say yes in the morning. There was more to build. She picked up her bag. She smoothed the fabric of the black dress once, a small, habitual motion. She looked at the ballroom below one last time, the whole picture of it, the light and the people and the city beyond the glass. Then she turned away from the balcony and walked toward the stairs, moving with the unhurried composure that she had maintained for 12 years in rooms like this one, except that now the composure was not a performance and not a strategy and not a form of protection. It was just who she was, the woman who had built the kingdom, walking, finally, in the open.